Hey everyone, welcome back. Ready for another deep dive. Today, we're going to dig into something super relevant to, well, everyone, population change.
It really is fascinating, isn't it? The ripple effects it has.
Absolutely. We're looking at excerpts from a grade 12 social studies slideshow, believe it or not. Who knew high school material could be so interesting?
Right. You'd be surprised what you can learn from revisiting these topics.
Okay, so the slideshow jumps right in talking about population growth rate. It's
Yeah.
all about percentages, right? How fast or slow a population's changing.
Yeah, exactly. Like a 2% growth rate, that's usually when governments and demographers really take notice. Significant growth, you could say.
Kind of like a measuring stick for how much a population's booming
They're not.
and not. The slideshow mentions immigration and emigration too, which makes sense.
It's not just about how many babies are born, right? People moving in and out, immigration and immigration, like you said, that plays a huge role too.
For sure. It's all connected. And then, of course, there are those classic birth rates and death rates.
The cornerstones of population change. More births, fewer deaths, and boom, your population grows.
Right. Though it's not always that simple, is it? The slideshow then gets into fertility rates,
Yeah.
and that adds another layer.
Yeah, so a fertility rate of 2.1, that's kind of the magic number, means each woman, on average, is having about 2.1 children, enough to replace the existing population.
Makes sense, but obviously you can't have a fraction of a person running around.
Exactly. We're talking real-world stuff here, so you round up to 3 kids per woman to make it practical.
Right. Got to keep it real. The slideshow says that globally, the average fertility rate as of 2023 is actually 2.32. So a tad higher than that replacement level.
It is. But things get even more interesting when you realize governments and organizations don't just look at these big general numbers. They're using all these tools to really dig into the data.
Oh, you mean like surveys and censuses, that kind of thing?
Yeah. And even GIS technology, those cool maps that show you data visually.
Right, right. It's like they're having a conversation with the data to understand what's really going on.
Exactly. It's about figuring out not just how many people, but where they live, how old they are, what their incomes, like all those pieces of the puzzle.
It's like painting a detailed portrait of a population, not just a quick sketch. Speaking of, the slideshow mentions the government of Newfoundland, and Labrador is doing some of this data digging, especially in the St. John's metro region.
Oh, yeah, which, by the way, is the most densely populated area in the entire province, according to the slideshow.
Huh, interesting. But then it kind of veers off into this whole history lesson about Newfoundland and Labrador's population. I mean, is that really necessary here?
Well, I think it's important to see the bigger picture. See, back in the 1800s and 1900s, tons of people flocked to Newfoundland and Labrador. We're talking something like 55,000 people, all drawn in by the fishing industry.
Ah, okay, so a classic boom and bust cycle.
Exactly. And that boom led to a pretty significant peak in their population, around 568,000 people back in 1991.
That's a lot of people.
Yeah.
But then what happens to the bust part, right?
Yeah. Unfortunately, yeah. Fish stocks went down, jobs dried up, and folks started looking for work elsewhere. Sadly, it's a story that's played out in various forms throughout history.
Yeah, it is. So what happened to Newfoundland and Labrador's population after that?
Well, it took a pretty big dip down to about 505,000 people.
Wow. So what's the situation like now? Have they managed to recover?
They have, at least to some extent. The slideshow says it's seen a bit of growth recently, bringing the population to about 530,000.
That's good to hear. Any idea what's driving that recent growth?
Well, it seems like immigration's playing a big role. Newfoundland and Labrador's attracting people from elsewhere to help boost their population.
That makes sense. It's amazing how population change ties into so many other things like economics, the environment, even government policies.
It's all interconnected, like threads in this giant tapestry. And speaking of connections, let's zoom out a bit, shall we? Time to look at some broader population trends, starting with Canada as a whole.
Okay, sounds good. I'm always up for a good zoom out. What's the story with Canada's population?
Well, picture this. It's 1867, Canada's just become a country, and the population is incredibly small compared to today.
Really? How small are we talking?
Just a sliver over 3,463,000 to be exact.
Wow, I had no idea it was that small. That's a far cry from where it is today.
Tell me about it. Fast forward to 2022, and the population has skyrocketed to over 38 million. 38,930,000, according to the slideshow.
Okay, now that's what I call growth. although I'm guessing it hasn't always been smooth sailing.
You're right about that. The slideshow does point out that Canada's population growth rate has actually slowed down a bit since the mid-20th century. It's currently hovering between 1% and 2% each year.
So even though the population's still going up, it's increasing at a slower pace than it used to.
Exactly. And get this statistics. Canada predicts that by 2060, Canada's population will hit a whopping 63 million.
Wow, 63 million? That's a pretty significant jump from where we are now.
It is. And the slideshow says that a lot of that projected growth is going to come from immigration, especially with Canada's aging population.
That makes sense. You need younger generations to keep things moving, right? Speaking of different parts of the country, the slideshow had this really interesting map of Canada with different regions shaded in different colors.
Ah, yeah, that was to highlight the differences in population growth across Canada. Remember how we were talking about the Avalon region in Newfoundland seeing some modest growth?
Yeah, I think it was somewhere between 0.1% and 2.4%.
Right. Well, the map showed that while Avalon's growing a little, other parts of Newfoundland are actually experiencing population decline. And not just a small dip, we're talking rates of decline from negative 2.5% all the way to negative 4.9% in some areas.
Wow, that's a huge difference. I guess it really highlights that population change isn't always about growth. What about other parts of Canada? What did the map show?
Well, on the complete opposite end of the spectrum, you have southern Ontario. That area is booming with growth rates between 10% and a staggering 20%.
It's like different parts of the country are living in completely different worlds when it comes to population.
Isn't that wild? And here's another interesting tidbit from the slideshow. It said that a full 50% of Canada's population lives below a certain line on a map. Sadly, we don't have the actual map to see where that line is.
Oh man, talk about a cliffhanger. But it does make you wonder what's so special about that line. What does it tell us about how people are distributed across the country?
Exactly. It's not just about the total number, but also where those people are concentrated.
Absolutely. Speaking of concentration, the slideshow then jumps into the pros and cons of living in areas with low and high population densities.
Yeah,
It even ties it back to the cost of living, which I know is something you're pretty interested in.
it's a big one these days, isn't it?
It's the age-old debate, the excitement of city life versus that peace and quiet you find in more rural areas. Not to mention the potential for lower housing costs. What's the slideshow's take on it?
It doesn't really pick sides, which is fair. It presents both perspectives. For example, it talks about the Greater Toronto Area, the GTA, and how its population has absolutely exploded in recent decades. Back in 1990, it was sitting at about 4 million people.
Right, I remember reading something about that. A lot of growth in the GTA.
A lot is an understatement.
Yeah.
By 2022, that number had jumped to a mind-blowing 7.28 million. The slideshow said that's like 1 in 5 Canadians living in the GTA now.
Wow. I mean, I know it's a big city, but still. That's a lot of people concentrated in one area. It must put a ton of pressure on things like housing costs.
You better believe it. The slideshow even poses the question, what effect does this kind of massive population growth have on housing affordability? And it's a question worth thinking about, like at what point does a city become too crowded, too expensive? How do you strike that balance between economic growth and a good quality of life?
Big questions for sure. It's like we're watching a real-time economics lesson unfold, just on a massive scale.
Exactly. And speaking of going big, the slideshow doesn't stop there. It zooms out even further, taking us global to explore population changes on the grandest scale of all.
Okay, so we've gone local, we've gone national, and now we're going global. This is why I love these deep dives. It's all connected. So what's the deal with global population change? What does the slideshow say?
Well, for starters, it challenges this common assumption we often have about population. You know how we tend to think it's always been steadily increasing?
Yeah, I'd say that's a pretty common belief. Slowly but surely, more people on Earth over time.
Right, that's what most of us picture. But the slideshow points out that for a surprisingly long time, the global population was actually pretty stable.
Really? That's not what I would have expected. Were there ever times when it actually went down?
Absolutely. Things like widespread diseases, famines, natural disasters, those events could cause significant population dips throughout history.
That makes sense. It wasn't until we hit that first billion people on Earth.
The 1800s, believe it or not, can you imagine? Just 1 billion people on the entire planet.
It's hard to wrap my head around that, especially now with us approaching 8 billion.
I know, right? It's incredible. And projections suggest that by the year 2100, that number could reach a mind-blowing 11 billion.
11 billion people. Wow.
Yeah.
It really makes you stop and think. But it's more than just the numbers, isn't it? The slideshow really encourages us to think about what's driving those numbers, those global population changes. Okay, so let's unpack that a bit. What are some of the big factors that cause populations to grow or shrink on that global scale? What's the slideshow's take on all of this?
Well, the slideshow highlights some pretty big players when it comes to population growth. Advancements in science, healthcare, technology, those are huge. Think about it. Better medicine means people live longer. Improved sanitation, more efficient food production, it all adds up.
Right, we're kind of pushing back against those natural limits that used to keep populations in check.
Exactly. And then, of course, there's the whole abundance of resources thing. When people have enough food, water, shelter, well, they're more likely to have bigger families. And then, of course, we can't forget about immigration, right? People moving from country to country that impacts populations all over the world.
It's like this constant global flow, people moving, population shifting. Some countries grow, some shrink. It all kind of feeds into the bigger picture.
hmm
But okay, what about those factors that actually cause populations to shrink?
Right. Well, the usual suspects are always going to be there, unfortunately. Disease outbreaks, natural disasters, wars, conflicts. Those can have devastating impacts on population numbers.
Yeah, those are the heavy hitters. But what about those other factors, the ones that maybe aren't as dramatic, but still have a big impact over time?
Oh, absolutely. The slideshow actually points to a lack of resources as being a major factor in population decline. I mean, it's pretty straightforward. Not enough food, water, shelter. You end up with famine, disease, and ultimately fewer people.
Right, it all ties back to those basic necessities, those fundamental building blocks for a population to thrive. But you mentioned those advancements in science earlier, and the slideshow actually gives this really fascinating example. A doctor named Ignaz Semmelweis.
Oh, yeah, Semmelweis. He's a great example of how one discovery can have a huge ripple effect.
Totally. So who was he? What's his story?
Well, Semmelweis was a Hungarian doctor back in the mid-1800s. And back then, lots of women were dying from infections after childbirth. It was a huge problem. And Semmelweis, he noticed this weird pattern. Doctors who did autopsies before delivering babies had way higher mortality rates among their patients.
Oh no, that's awful.
It was a serious issue. And Semmelweis, he had this hunch, right? He thought maybe something was being transferred from the autopsies to the mothers. So he did something really simple, but at the time it was quite radical. He insisted that doctors wash their hands.
Wash their hands.
Yeah.
With soap and water, you mean?
Well, back then it was with a chlorine solution. But yeah, basically, he wanted them to disinfect their hands before delivering babies. And guess what?
Why? What happened?
It worked. The death rates plummeted after Semmelweis made that one change. Just goes to show you how powerful basic hygiene can be.
It's amazing how something we take for granted today was such a game changer back then.
Right. And the thing is, this all ties back to population trends, right? Because when you reduce deaths, especially from preventable causes, it naturally influences how a population grows.
Absolutely. One doctor's observation, one simple intervention, and suddenly you've changed the course of countless lives and ultimately the trajectory of a population. It's
Yeah,
amazing.
exactly. It highlights how interconnected everything really is. Speaking of connections, the slideshow brings up this crucial concept called carrying capacity.
Okay, carrying capacity, that sounds pretty important. So what is it and how does it fit into all of this?
Well, imagine Earth is like a big spaceship, right? And we, humans, we're all passengers on this spaceship. Now, our spaceship Earth, it's got a limited amount of resources, right? Air, water, food, all that good stuff. Carrying capacity is basically the maximum number of passengers Earth can support, the maximum population it can sustain without running out of those essential resources.
So it's all about finding that balance between the number of people and the resources available to support them.
Exactly. And what's fascinating is that the slideshow points out that we've actually managed to increase Earth's carrying capacity over time. And you know how we've done that.
Oh.
Advancements in science and technology, especially in those areas like agriculture and healthcare that directly impact our ability to survive and thrive. I mean, think about it. We've come a long way from hunting and gathering for food, right?
No kidding.
We can produce more food than ever before, and we've got treatments and medications that have eradicated or at least controlled so many diseases that used to wipe out entire populations. But that doesn't mean we have unlimited space and resources. And that's where the slideshow's discussion of the stages of human population and development comes in.
Right, I mentioned there were like 4 distinct stages we've gone through, each one linked to changes in our carrying capacity. So what are those stages exactly?
Okay, so picture this. It's way back in the day, right? Stage 1, hunting and gathering. People were totally dependent on whatever food they could find in their immediate environment. obviously not super reliable, led to a pretty unstable food supply and fluctuating populations.
Yeah, I can imagine. Sounds like a pretty precarious way to live. So what changed?
Enter stage two, the Neolithic Revolution. This is when agriculture emerged. People learned to cultivate crops and raise animals, which meant a more stable food surplus, and because of that, a significant population increase.
Okay, so farming, that was a game changer.
Big time. Fast forward a bit, and we've got stage three, the Industrial Revolution. We're talking mechanized farming, factories popping up, massive increases in food production, and yet another surge in population growth.
Wow, so each stage seems to bring about these more efficient ways to produce food and support more people.
Exactly. And it doesn't stop there. Finally, we reach stage four, the Green Revolution and the Age of Genetic Modification.
Okay, now we're talking chemical fertilizers, GMOs, all that jazz.
Exactly. All these technologies that further ramped up food production and allowed for even larger populations.
It's incredible how far we've come, from hunting and gathering to literally modifying the genetic makeup of our food.
I know, right? It's mind-blowing when you think about it. But then it begs the question, with all these advancements, with a global population potentially hitting 11 billion, how do we make sure everyone has enough? How do we ensure a sustainable future?
That's the billion-dollar question, isn't it? What does the slideshow say about that?
Well, it doesn't offer any easy answers because, honestly, there aren't any. But it does highlight this model that's been used to try and understand how populations change over time, specifically when it comes to births and deaths. It's called the demographic transition model.
The demographic transition model. That's a mouthful.
I know, right? DTM for short.
DTM got it. So what is it? Some kind of supercomputer that predicts the future of population.
Well, not exactly a supercomputer, but it's a way of tracking those natural changes in population, those shifts in birth and death rates that happen as societies evolve.
Interesting. So it's more than just looking at how many people are born and die each year.
Yeah, it breaks down population change into 5 distinct stages, each with its own patterns of births and deaths. It's actually pretty cool.
Okay, I'm intrigued. Walk me through it. What do those stages look like?
Okay, so stage 1, they call it high stationary. And it's exactly what it sounds like, high birth rates and high death rates. So imagine a time before modern medicine, before proper sanitation. Infant mortality was tragically common, life expectancy was short. It was a tough time to be alive.
Yeah, no kidding. I can only imagine. So how do societies move beyond that?
Well, as they develop, they start to get a handle on things like healthcare, sanitation, nutrition, and that's when you start to see a shift to stage 2, which they call early expanding.
Early expanding, huh? What's expanding?
The population. In this stage, death rates start to drop. People are living longer, healthier lives. But those birth rates, they stay pretty high, so you've got more people surviving, more babies being born, and boom, the population starts to grow rapidly.
I see where the expanding part comes in. Makes sense.
Yeah.
What happens next? Do those birth rates eventually go down too?
They do, but it takes a little time. That's stage 3, late expanding. This is when things start to level out a bit. Birth rates decline, often because of things like increased access to education, especially for women, and family planning options.
So it's not just about births and deaths in a vacuum. It's also about people's choices, their access to resources and information.
Exactly. It's way more nuanced than just looking at raw numbers. And then we move into stage 4, low stationary.
Low stationary. I feel like I can guess what this one's about.
Probably. This is where both birth rates and death rates are relatively low. You've reached kind of equilibrium and the population stabilizes.
Got it. So what's the final stage?
Well, the 5th stage is actually a relatively recent addition to the model. They call it declining.
Declining. That sounds a little ominous. What's happening there?
Basically, birth rates have fallen below death rates, meaning the population is actually shrinking.
Really? Wow, I didn't realize that was happening in some parts of the world.
It is, and it's becoming increasingly common in developed countries, particularly those with aging populations and low birth rates. It's a whole other set of challenges and opportunities that demographers are grappling with right now.
Wow, the DTM really highlights how complex this whole population thing is. It's not just one straight line, is it?
Absolutely not. It's this intricate dance of factors, economic conditions, social norms, access to healthcare, education levels, even cultural beliefs. It all plays a role in how a population grows and changes over time. It's pretty fascinating stuff.
I'm with you on that. It's amazing what you can uncover when you really take a deep dive into a topic. It really makes you realize that population change isn't just some abstract concept, you know? It's about real people, real lives, all being shaped by these forces.
Exactly. And it's not just about looking back, is it? It's about looking ahead and wondering what comes next, especially with that projected 11 billion by 2100. I mean, how do we even begin to wrap our heads around a future with that many people?
It's a big question, that's for sure. And the slideshow doesn't shy away from it either. Did it offer any insights into how we can ensure a sustainable future for such a massive global population?
Well, it doesn't pretend to have all the answers because, let's be honest, no one does. But it does stress the importance of understanding those key factors we've been talking about, those things that drive population change. We've already seen how advancements in areas like agriculture, healthcare, technology, those can have a huge impact.
It's like we're in a race against time, always trying to innovate faster than the challenges emerge.
In a way, yeah. We've got to find new, sustainable ways to produce food for a growing population. We've got to develop even better healthcare systems and maybe even rethink our whole approach to consumption. Can we meet our needs without depleting the planet's resources? Those are the big questions.
It's like we're entering this whole new chapter of human ingenuity, right?
Yeah.
Where the biggest challenges are also the biggest drivers of innovation.
Exactly. And it's not just about tech either, right? It's about understanding those social, economic, and political systems that influence population change, creating a world that's not just sustainable, but equitable, too.
Well said. You've given us a lot to think about today, expert speaker. Everything from those nitty-gritty details of birth and death rates to that big picture concept of carrying capacity, not to mention the power of innovation. It's clear that population change is this incredibly complex, always evolving issue. It's not something we can just ignore.
It really is one of those topics that touches every aspect of our lives, and it's a conversation that's only going to become more important as we move into the future.
Absolutely. Well, to our amazing listeners, we hope this deep dive has sparked your curiosity, maybe even given you a new perspective on the forces shaping our world's population. It's a big topic, but hey, that's what we're here for. Until next time, keep those brains buzzing, and thanks for joining us on the deep dive.